I'm Peter Marks, theater critic for The Washington Post.
And I'm Elizabeth Vincentelli, and I write for The New York Times. Oh, okay, so I can't believe this is happening, but we are back. It's been too long, way too long. Life happened. Life happened, that's all I can say. But we're back with another episode of Marks and Vincentelli, a podcast about theater, here, there, everywhere, now, yesterday, tomorrow. We're covering it all. So a big reason why we've been delayed is, Peter, you finally, it happened.
Yep.
It happened.
I got COVID. I got COVID, ladies and gentlemen, in September, which, Elizabeth, from your own experience, turns your world upside down for a while. Or at least it requires you to retreat from it, which is not easy for a theater critic when things are revving up again after the summer, which actually was pretty busy even then. My case was pretty mild. Thank you very much. I found out I was positive because I had to take a PCR test before I was to interview none other than Tom Stoppard, with many, has got a new play on Broadway, Leopoldstadt.
So wait, did you have any inkling? Were you not feeling good, or did that come as a shock that you were positive?
No, I had like what I thought was a cold, which I had earlier in the pandemic period. I had the sniffles one other time, and I thought, oh, I'm getting the sniffles again. I didn't think it was COVID, but indeed it was. And, it was mild. It was all the symptoms of a mild cold over about 3 or 4 days. So it didn't really, it wasn't very disruptive in that sense, but I had to wait till I tested negative again. And of course, it scuttled my face-to-face interview with Tom Stoppard, which pissed me off no end. It was also with Patrick Marber, the director. So I thought it really was an indication, Elizabeth, that, well, first of all, I thought I was somehow immune, and I wasn't. I found that out. And secondly, this thing isn't over. It's not going away. And I hear there's another. We're probably going to have Blythe Adamson back on again to tell us. I hear there's another variant coming.
Oh, there's a couple of variants that sound really nasty. Really nasty.
I know. And I just learned about a show in D.C. that had to cancel performances because somebody tested positive. So it's it's an ongoing part of our lives.
I've got to share with our listeners a crazy email, because I got to tell you, this is very typical of what's out there. So in July, I went back to Creede, Colorado, and I wrote a follow-up to my story from last year. And Creede is a company in a very tiny town, in a very tiny county, Mineral County. It's very isolated, and I had booked my trip and everything, and they had to close down the theater for 10 days because they had COVID running rampant through the company. And they came back into action 2 days before I arrived there. So I saw all the shows that I was supposed to see, and they were, I talked to everybody there, and they were a little shell-shocked. So I write this piece talking about that, that they had to close for 10 days, and that now one of the conditions for reopening was that audiences had to be masked. That was not optional. It was mandatory. And I made a comment saying, not an easy sell, because Creede gets a lot of its patrons from Texas, Oklahoma, those states. And I say something like states where they're not really really into masks, something like that. And I get this email from this gentleman saying, very polite, saying that he could not believe that I had fallen for Creede Theater's alarmist, response to COVID, and that Mineral County had not had a positive test since May. And why were they requesting masks, and calling me bigoted for saying that Texas and Oklahoma did not like masks, which I'm sorry, but that is a fact. And so I wrote back saying, well, there were cases in Mineral County. It was like in the red zone on the New York Times, county map. It was deep red. It was the reddest you can get. So there had been cases. Not only had there been cases, but I personally talked to people who had COVID, who had just recovered from it. Someone's wife had to go to the hospital because she got COVID and she was pregnant. And I said to that guy who wrote to me, I said, so did these people lie to me? Is that what you're saying? Where are you getting your information? Because that is not true. And I wanted to say, XYZ 1003 on Facebook that's sending you your information is making stuff up. This is this is insane. So they're not alarmists. They're doing what they have to do their season. And he wrote back, not giving an inch, saying, no. COVID has been completely blown out of proportion. And this is when I did not respond. This clearly, we are on two different levels of reality there.
Yeah.
But I was completely stunned to get that email. I've got to tell you.
Yeah. We're not on, it's just more evidence that we're not on the same page. But you and I are on the same page about our love of aspects of the theater. One of them we're going to talk about today.
Yes.
And maybe you can let the audience in, Elizabeth, on who we're going to speak to.
Today we have a guest that I'm particularly excited about because his role is so central to the way you and I and audiences take in. It's so central to the way we take in a show, whether it's a play or a musical. And he's the Tony-winning set designer, Beowulf Boritt. And set designs is completely, it's the first thing you see when you get into a show very often because many places now don't even have a curtain anymore. So there's not that big reveal. So the first you enter, you see the set. So it is literally the center of attention. And very often it gets its own applause too, as we've been there when the set gets applause. So we're going to talk about what goes into making that happen. The craft of set design. And he's actually currently is on Broadway. He did the set for the new revival of The Piano Lesson with Samuel L. Jackson and Daniel Brooks. And he won a Tony for the set of James Lapine's adaptation of Moss Art's Act One. But other stuff you may have seen his work, he did. He's done quite a few shows at the Delacorte for Shakespeare in the Park. He did, for instance, Saheem Ali's Merry Wives. Which was on PBS. So I think a lot of people may have seen that. And he also did Be More Chill. I think he did Off-Broadway and Broadway. And I think he also did it in London. And interesting shows, too. He did Susan Stroman's Marie Dancing More Still at Fifth Avenue Theater in Seattle. He did Squirrels at La Jolla. He's just all over the map.
And Beowulf's just written a book about this very subject. Published just this second, called Transforming Space Over Time, Set Design and Visual Storytelling with Broadway's Legendary Directors. It's a book about the process, about making art and making theater and making sets, focusing on 6 of Beowulf's productions and the directors of it. 5 of those productions were on Broadway. The set for POTUS, or Behind Every Great Dumbass Are 7 Women Trying to Keep Him Alive, which had an amazing revolving set of replicas of rooms in the White House. Just really fun, which we'll also talk about. He also designed the set, many people will know, for Come From Away, the long-running musical that literally just closed on Broadway. Anyway, with that introduction, welcome, Beowulf.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
So we have enormous amounts of questions for you as, of course, lovers of sets. Both Elizabeth and I are devotees, and we often feel we don't have enough space in a review to talk about the set. So it's a thrill to have you here and to talk about both your book and your work. But just some basic questions, Beowulf.
Sure.
How did you get started as a set designer? What is the calling here? Yeah. And how do you answer the call when you're a young man?
It's the book was something of an attempt to answer that, but I have several answers, and I'm not sure any of them is quite the truth. But I was a kid who liked to draw. I liked to express things visually, and I would, from a young age, when my father would read me books, I would then draw illustrations of what had happened in the book. And so from quite a young age, I did that, and I started making dioramas of scenes from books, from the Lord of the Rings specifically, but from kind of any book. And there's pictures of me from 7 or 8 years old using blocks and little toy action figures, setting up scenes from books. And I think that probably is the answer. I had a drive to do that kind of thing when I was in high school, and I started doing the school play also, and enjoyed that while I was in elementary school and junior high. When I was in high school, I interned at a summer theater in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where I lived at that time. And that was the first time I actually experienced a set designer. There was a man who taught at the local college who designed the sets for this summer theater. And that was the first time I understood that that was a job, that somebody made things that were the world that actors existed in. And I think probably that was the moment I decided I would do this with my life. I fell in love with that idea. The next year, my senior year in high school, I talked my English teacher into letting me design the sets for the school plays. And I was off and running. My father was a college professor. He's still alive, but is retired. And so that was the world I knew. And I think I expected I would become a set design professor somewhere. But I went to NYU for graduate school to get an MFA. And that put me into New York City. And that was pivotal for me. By the time I got out of NYU, I had decided, okay, I'm going to stick around a little and try to do this professionally. And nearly 25 years later, I'm still sticking around and still trying to do it.
That's amazing.
It's amazing to me that your first thought actually was that you would teach it rather than do it. I find that pretty wild.
I don't, it's not so unique, honestly. I will say I don't feel like I don't know that I believed you could make a living doing it. And that was part of the gift of NYU, was seeing professors who were working in the field, but also teaching, but seeing people making a living doing it. But I will say, when I talk to design students in design programs, I feel like 90% of them, their plan is to teach because they don't believe they can make a living doing it as a professional. Which is not to say that it's easy to make a living doing it as a professional. It is a lot of people want to do it. There's a lot of competition, and there's a lot of very talented designers who, just don't have the break or don't have the good luck that sort of puts them in a position to be able to make a living doing it. So I don't know. I feel blessed every day that I am able to actually, pay for my housing and pay for food on the table by doing this thing that I love.
Who were you influenced by, Beowulf? Who, you had to have, not only was it clearly generated by you, this organic desire to move people around a stage in an architectural space, who did you look to figure out that this was something that had a real craft and art to it?
Yeah, I mean, the first person in a funny way is my own grandmother, who she studied design, or she studied art at Wellesley in the 1930s, and she used to tell me stories about painting sets. I don't think she was designing them per se, but she worked on building sets for the plays at Wellesley back in the 30s. So in a sense, she was the first set designer I met. And when I started doing it, she would sort of tell me about that. She actually, as a young woman, she had entered a contest for Marshall Fields and got first place nationally for a dress design competition, and was offered a chance to come to Chicago and be an intern designer for Marshall Fields. But my great-grandfather, who was a New England industrialist, didn't think that was an appropriate thing for a woman to do, and she instead got married. But she was intensely artistic. She lived on a 40-acre farm outside of Boston and had these incredible gardens, they're actually recorded at the Smithsonian. They were quite impressive. And that's how she expressed herself. That was sort of the spaces that she began to create, were these beautiful gardens that she spent most of her life creating. So that is my honest first influence on someone who I saw shaping space and creating beauty in that way. But I think, I had a lot of wonderful set design teachers along the way. In terms of, kind of famous set designers, I think Joe Malziner he was the sort of the legend who I encountered, never personally. He died when I was very young and I never met him. But I got a hold of his book about set design when I was in college. And he was the most brilliant artist ever. His renderings are just breathtaking, and kind of left me despairing of ever being able to paint because you can't live up to what he does. But the way he created space and the sort of the simplicity of often what he does, and the way he uses light to reveal objects, so that you're actually not putting that much out there. It's sort of a way of focusing space. I would say he was a huge influence on me as well. I mean, I could list probably 25 people who are. The last person I would say, interestingly, is a teacher named Eduardo Sicango, who was a brilliant designer, taught at NYU when I was there, and worked in an immensely different style from what I kind of naturally did. My undergraduate professors were very much the sort of Yale 1950s school of design, kind of very conceptual design, and pushed me to go to NYU to study with John Conklin, who was from that same world. And that was kind of the grounding of my education. Eduardo does a much sort of lighter, frillier, frothier, pretty sort of design. He's done Radio City, he's done the Circus, he's done those kind of things. And I had one class with him, and I think we were maybe designing a ballet, and I was just stuck on it. And at one day he said to me, "Beowulf, just because it is pretty doesn't mean it can't have an idea behind it." And oddly, that was a revelation for me, that I could still do a conceptual design, but drive those ideas into something frothy, and it could be pink and bubbly and covered with mirrors and glitter, but still have an idea behind it. And that really kind of opened up a whole new world of kind of musical theater, and a level of theater that I think I'd turned my nose up at before, that suddenly I thought, oh, this is my way into that. This is how I can do those things. And I owe him a huge debt of gratitude. It was one of those ideas that was opened a window for me, and opened up a vast new array of opportunities for me.
Oh, okay. Like when you say that something has to have an idea behind it, can you, for instance, can you give us an example of, do you mean a driving concept for a set, like something that?
Yeah, that is what I mean. It's not. I think when I was young, I used to feel like I had to boil that down to a sentence. The set means X, and I don't really mean that anymore. Over time, what it's developed into for me is. When I approach a script, I read the play and I talk to the director, and I'm trying to find out what are the ideas in this script that we want to emphasize. Because usually there's a lot more there than you can put into the design. But what is the most important thing that we are trying to tell with this story? And how can I start to represent that visually? So in the case of Act 1, for example, James said to me when we were starting working on that play, it's a story about a young man trying to make his way in the theater. And I have this vision of him banging on a lot of doors, trying to get through locked doors. And that was ultimately the idea that kind of led to this massive set with staircases for him to run up and down and doors everywhere. And this sort of constantly trying to get from one room to the next to sort of, expand your horizons. In conjunction with that, the other thing that I wrestle with a lot when I'm starting to figure out a design idea is most of what I do are musicals or plays with multiple locations in them. So probably the scenery is going to be changing. Things are going to come on, things are going to go off. And how that happens is going to affect the pacing of the storytelling. The show is going to take place over 90 minutes or whatever it is. And if I do a 2-minute scene change in there, that's a big percentage of storytelling time. So that better be an important scene change. Whereas in something like Act 1, where the set is changing every 30 seconds to a new location, it has to be almost instantaneous because you don't want to bog the play down. But if there are moments where you can do a big, massive scene change where that actually can have some story import, and suddenly you do want to stop and breathe and let that happen and let that take center stage for a moment. But trying to marry that to the rhythm of the script, and that has to come from the director and from the writing to a degree, how we want to marry those things together so that the rhythm of the physical transformations is mirroring the rhythms of the storytelling and the writing and the directing.
That's so interesting, Beowulf, to hear you talk about your process and what goes through your mind. As an artist, how important is it to you to have these ideas understood by the people seeing the work versus the utility of the set and it serving the production? Are they two separate things?
I think they're sort of the same thing, but what I will say is whatever my kind of concept is, I don't expect an audience to walk away and understand that. Every so often somebody does, and it always kind of delights me when somebody exactly gets it, but that is not the point. The point is serving the story, and that's ultimately what all of us are doing. I say to students all the time when I'm talking to classes, theater is an actor speaking words to an audience. That at its base form is what it is, and everything else has to be in support of that. And so everything I'm doing is driving towards how do you make a human being sort of important and big and focused on the stage, and how can I kind of visually reinforce the themes of the play. And no, I don't expect or care that an audience is going to understand those kind of conceptual things underpinning it. But I am pleasantly surprised how often people sort of get it, and whether they articulate it the same way I would or not, they do get the kind of basic idea that I'm going for.
Do you? I guess it's a mix of you being approached, but also do you sometimes have to apply for a job? Like, do you have to send an idea of a concept, or how does that work?
I don't usually pitch ideas, very occasionally, but not that often, especially at sort of this point in my life. Most often somebody calls me and says, "Do you want to do this show now?" And and then I say yes. And when in the process really depends. It's ideally on a big show, on a big musical, I might work on it for a couple of years before we do it. Sometimes I do them faster. Peter, you mentioned POTUS earlier, and that one was extremely fast. I'd actually been talking about the show with Susan Stroman for a number of years. We were planning to do it before the pandemic, but we didn't expect to be doing it last season. So we had kind of the roughest of ideas that we talked about the idea of a turntable set. And I had done a very, very rough model of kind of that idea. And that's where it sat until January 10th of last year, when suddenly we found out we had the Schubert Theater in 3 weeks' time, and I had to crank out a set very quickly. So that was a case of designing that entire set in about 10 days, getting it built at a shop in 4 weeks, and we were in the theater with it, with actors in it, that fast. And that's probably the fastest I've ever done it. And we are really lucky that we managed to do that. There are 1,000 things could have made that not happen. New York that I'm doing next spring, I've been working on for over a year at this point. And so I'll have been working on it for a year and a half by the time it hits the theater. And on a big music, and it's been just barely enough time, to be honest. The show is so massive and sprawling, and there's so much to deal with on it that it's taken, not every minute of that year and a half, but big chunks of every week.
And when you say working on it, do you mean like working on like designs on a computer? Like, because it's not actually, because then you build it, right? I assume in a shop, and then it's moved in.
Correct. Yeah, so working on it really means from the moment I'm hired, from the first time I read the script. I'll read the script, and I'll go in and talk to the director right away. I mean, that's within, as soon as I have the job, within the first week, I've probably done all that. Just to get like a basic sense of what are your ideas? What do we want to emphasize? I don't need much more than that. What's the feeling we're trying to evoke? And then really the reason I wrote the book is what happens next varies on every show. I've done over 450 designs now, and the process is a little different every time. It almost always starts with the script and the director, and the end of the kind of design process, it's not even the end of the process, but the end of the sort of first part of it is I build a three-dimensional scale model. And over my shoulder, you can see one right there. But I do a very intricate scale model of what the entire set is going to be. And those can take, weeks, even months to build, depending on the complexity of the show. But how I get to that varies. Sometimes it's sketches on the computer. Sometimes it's hand-drawn sketches. Sometimes it's a lot of research. It's usually a mix of all of those things. It's often very, very rough models that are just, I call it a sketch model, where, the details are not really filled in, but it kind of shows how things work, or lets me start to figure out how space is going to move, in the space that I'm in relation to a human being on that stage. On some shows, it's on the first or second attempt, I get something that works and the director likes it, and that's what the set is in the end. Sometimes we go through many, many iterations of that. These, and each one of those iterations takes some time. I have to think through the whole show and how the whole show is going to work before I can really pitch an idea to the director. So I talk about this a bit in the book with the Sondheim on Sondheim chapter, where we went through, I think, about 7 very different designs before we finally got to the one that we did in the end. And others come faster. Others take a time or two. But once I've created that model, then that is the sort of footprint for what the set is going to be. And then we create, usually my assistants, but to a degree me, we create architectural drawings, basically, of all of this. It's technical drawings of every piece of scenery, how big they are, what they need to do, what we think it's made of, how it's going to interact with the other pieces. And that in itself can be quite a time-consuming process. And then usually we take those and we send them out to all of the different scene shops that might build the show, and they give us bids and pricing on it. And, we'll go back and forth, but eventually we'll select a scene shop, and hopefully we can afford everything I want. But if we can't, then we get rid of some of it. And then they start building it. And then I'm there sort of, probably once a week. I come up to the shop and see, is this the right red? Does this steel look right? Does this feel right? I am not responsible for the actual technical engineering of it. I'm not qualified to do it. Although over the years, I kind of have a sense of, what will work or not work. But the engineers in the shops, especially with the sets on the scale that I'm doing now, are responsible for making it safe and making it move and making all of the motors that move scenery around Broadway work properly. So they build it all in the shop, and then it's all taken apart and put in the back of a truck and dragged down to 44th Street, and it sits on the sidewalk on 44th Street for an afternoon before we drag it into the theater. And then we put it all back together again. And that process on a big show can take a month, getting it all into the theater and getting it all working. On a really big show, it can take more than a month. But that's painstaking. And one of the secrets of Broadway theaters that I think non-technical people don't understand is they are not big. The backstage is minuscule in most of them. And, when you're doing a play, it's fine. When you're doing a big musical with a lot of scenery, everything is designed within about a half inch of smashing into something else. And so it's important that it all be built very precisely. If suddenly something is a half inch too big, it literally won't be able to get on stage because it's going to hit something else. And the technicians who do it are very good at it. But it means, when you're watching something fly in from above, it has to be exactly plumb. It can't be tipped forward or backwards by an inch or two. And when something's 25 feet tall, it's very easy for it to be a little bit off kilter. So the precision with which all of that is put together, which allows it to function within a Broadway theater on a big show, is kind of mind-boggling. And it takes a while to figure out and put it together. And once you do all that, you're suddenly adding the actors in the show. Then you're actually adding all this stuff that we've done back into the show and making it function with that. And we spend, anywhere from a week to several weeks teching the show, writing the light cues, writing the sound cues, making all the motors that move the scenery, getting those calibrated so they're running at the right time, so they're safe, and so on and so forth. And, the actors sit around bored out of their heads for 3 weeks while we're doing that. And at the end of that, we try to put it all together and actually run the show. And you through that process, you have to find the show again. The first run through after you've been teching a show for 10 days is, it's wonderful to see, and it's also kind of a mess because everyone is just trying to dodge scenery and not get run over and remember their lines and remember their blocking and all of that. And usually that happens a day or two before the first time an audience is coming in the door. There's times when the final dress rehearsal the night before the first audience is the first time we're ever actually running all of it together for the first time. And then through previews, we get that smoothed out and hopefully all of the rough edges polished and whatever we're finding doesn't work, we get fixed. But that kind of beginning to end is my process.
That's a great description, Beowulf. And I think, it's interesting. You won the Tony for Act One, which is a very elaborate set, very eye-filling, impressive. The kind of thing I think that awards granters or people that judge tend to favor. And I don't always think that that's, there has to be some understanding of the dimensions of the set and the way it catches the eye has to correspond to the show. And I think for that reason, the very refined vision that you had for Come From Away really served that piece as effectively as if you had done, a massive construction that took 18 scene changes. That really felt distilled to something that really made sense in terms of what this story had to be, which was the dozen actors switching between being the residents of Gander, Newfoundland, and people from around the world, and it had to be done on the turn of a dime. And in a sense, that was what you created on that stage, along with a kind of representation of the scenery, the sense of a Canadian province, somewhere in the Maritimes. And I wondered, is that something that you distill? Do you come up with something more elaborate in your head because you want to show the people who are doing it all the possibilities? Or do you start with economy and think about, I'm only going to have this to work with? I'm interested in how you converse with the spaces and the demands of the work that you're doing?
It varies from show to show, but in the case of Come From Away, in that one we did never discuss doing a whole lot more in terms of location and things. The idea from the beginning was always that we were going to have 12 actors and 12 chairs, and we could use those to make almost everything we needed. And again, it comes from the demands of the script. As you said, those actors are changing character on a dime, and often they're a character for one line, and they're another character, and then they're another character. And so, at its very basic, I knew they were never going to be costumed fully as those characters because there was not time to do it. They had to shift instantly from one to the next, and anything that indicated those character shifts was going to be at most a hat or a pair of glasses or something that could be pulled on or off that simply, which therefore meant the set could not be doing something more literal or more realistic than that, or they'd be at odds with each other. So the set had to also be something that was abstract enough that lighting could change it, because lighting can change it instantly, whereas even the fastest scenic moves takes a couple of seconds. And the thing that set relies on, and frankly, it's in some ways my favorite kind of theater to do. Scott's Brew Boys was very much the same thing. It's relying on the audience's imagination. In the book, I talk about Hal Prince said to me once, and I think he said it a lot. He said, he was talking about musicals, but it's theater in general. He said you want to leave a lot of blank space. You want to leave room for the audience's imagination to fill in the blanks. And it's a touchstone for me. What the audience imagines is always going to be more powerful than what I can put on stage. And then the audience is imagining the perfect airplane or the perfect wallpaper or the perfect whatever for them. It's not my choice. It's what the audience imagines. And my goal is to do just enough to jostle that, to make that happen. Sometimes you can do truly nothing, but usually you need to do a little bit. But you want just enough to kind of get that process started and kind of jog the audience into complicity. And then you're wheeled. And that is the superpower of the theater, is that the audience's imagination is part of it. It doesn't really happen in other art forms. Film is a very realistic form in general. And it's a visual form, and it is always showing literal things. Even if it's an imagined thing, it's sort of a literal representation of that imagined thing. There are films that prove what I'm saying to be false, but in general, that's the way it works. Whereas theater, when it tries to be too literal, tends to fall on its face and feel a little heavy and lumpen. Or this is my take on it anyway. And the more that we can lean into the theatricality and let words and mood and light tell the story, that's when theater becomes incredibly nimble and really can leverage the imagination into storytelling. But what I will also say is on almost every show that I do, my instinct is to start with as little as possible. I'll go through and read the script and say, what are the things the script is calling for? And so even in the case of Act 1, which was a big elaborate set, in some ways it was the least the script was calling for, because the way the James wrote it like a Kaufman and Hart play. I had to have doors that opened, I had to have typewriters that worked, I had to have sinks with running water. There were a lot of things that I needed. And each of those locations didn't tend to have a whole lot more than those things. As you remember, none of those locations had walls. They were just kind of frames with a couple of windows stuck up stage. So even though it absolutely was an enormous set, and it was quite expensive and elaborate to build, each of the scenes was fairly minimal. And I think that, again, was part of the strength of it, that it was as big and sprawling as it was sort of trying to boil each thing down to as little as I could put on stage.
Well, it's very your approach in general, again, very roughly speaking, is not the stuff that I call the RTM, the ready to move in. You know, those sets that are super, that are like apartments where, oh my God, is this like a model apartment? Like you could almost, it's the kitchen is working. It's like super detailed. Like there's books. You don't seem to go for that necessarily. Like some other designers might have had like part of a real plane in Come From Away. You don't do that at all. It's just not your approach. Is that something that you've theorized, or is it just like such like a gut thing for you that you don't
sort
even?
Of a gut thing. I mean, it comes from the things I was talking about, but it's interesting. I very much, as I said, I just try not to put things on stage if we're not going to use them. And that's, which is not to say there's not some dressing that creates ambiance in my sets, but I just finished up Piano Lesson. We're just about to open. And that is a show that, when I was hired for it, honestly, I assumed I was going to do a box set, and what we've done is not that at all. It's not abstract exactly, but it's certainly a non-literal, non-realistic set. But the needs of the play require some literal, realistic things. We have a stove, and we have a sink, and we have a front door, and so on.
A piano.
And a piano, very key a piano. But as you'll see when you guys see it, there is very little beyond the props that the actors are actually using, although it is in some ways an elaborate set. I didn't even sort of exactly think it through and say, oh, this is how I'm going to do it. But as we got into previews, I realized there are, I think, there's maybe only one piece of furniture that is not very directly interacted with on the entire set. And so it is, again, I'm sort of trying to focus in on the things that we need, put in the storytelling pieces that we need, and not put a lot of extraneous stuff there. And I think this is, I guess, just my own style sense. It makes it more theatrical. It makes it more interesting. And it doesn't waste the audience's time looking at or thinking about extraneous stuff.
Beowulf, I've gone to plays where you're in the audience. I've actually seen you sitting. I know you go and watch theater.
Yeah.
And I always love the idea of thinking, what is he looking at? What is it about this that is either like pleasing him or displeasing him? Can you talk? Can you stand outside yourself a little bit and think about what is it that you look for in a play that you're not? This helps us as critics, I think.
Oh.
What is it that when you will see a show and go, wow, I really admire what this designer has done. Can you touch that in your own experience?
To a degree. I mean, I think it's a professional hazard that it's actually very hard for me to lose myself in theater. I can go to a film and lose myself in it in TV very easily because it's not a medium that I work in much. It's very hard for me to completely divorce myself from analyzing things when I'm at the theater. But so I guess what that means is when a show is most successful for me is when that happens, when it does, the emotion of it takes over me and I'm just following the story and not paying attention to how did they do it, but just truly watching the characters and watching the story. But I think the shows that do that for me are few and far between at this point because it's so easy for me to get distracted by how did they do that? What is that? And interestingly, it's more often dance pieces or something like that where that happens because it's a medium I'm just slightly less conversant in, and I'm certainly less technically able to analyze dance. I can enjoy it and I love watching it, but I don't know whether this was a good grand jeté or not, or whether it was a hard thing to do or not. I just know what my reaction to it is. So I will say one of the pieces that I've loved the most in the past year was a piece that Tyler Peck and Michelle Dorrance did at City Center last spring. I think it only played for 3 days maybe, but it was Tyler Peck on point and Michelle Dorrance tap dancing together. And it was one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen. I would not have, and Michelle's style is so specific, and Tyler's style is so specific, and you would not think those things would play well together. And it was brilliant. It was magic to watch, and just swept me away. And there was very little set design to it. Against a lot of black, brilliantly lit by a lighting designer named Brandon Sterling Baker. But again, the lighting focused you so tightly and focused the action so tightly that you were kind of watching figures picked out of darkness the entire time. And that was one of the things that I loved about it. What I will say, you asked me about admiring other designers' work, and the thing that I tend to love is when I see a designer do something that is completely different from what I would have done, and yet it's good. I will say that I'm arrogant enough that if I go to something and think, oh, I could have done that better, then I'm not enjoying it. But there are examples of things where I think, oh, that would not have been my instinct with this piece of theater, and yet it works, and it maybe does it better than what I would have thought of. And an example of that I often give is Wicked, which I think if I had been handed the script of Wicked, I would have designed The Wizard of Oz. And I don't think it actually would have served the piece well. I think the kind of crazy broken clocked factory thing that Eugene made adds a weight to that script and to that storytelling that my more bubblegum version of it would probably not have given to it. And those are the kind of things that I really admire when a design is able to, and its design at its best, is able to help frame a story in a way that helps tell the story in a better way than some other form of design might have done.
Mm.
You just mentioned lighting in that dance piece. Like, how closely do you work with the lighting designer? Like,
incredibly closely. It is the director, I would say, is my most crucial collaborator, but after that it's the lighting designer. A bad lighting designer can make a good set look terrible, and a good lighting designer can make a bad set look great. It is of the people that I have any sway in who gets hired on a show, and sometimes I'm asked about the lighting designer, sometimes I'm not. The director does the hiring. But it is the position that I probably care the most about in terms of my immediate collaborators. And it stylistically depends on the show. Sometimes, one lighting designer is better for one project than somebody else would be. That depends a little bit too. And some are more versatile. Some can do a lot of different things. Some have a more specific style. But I want someone whose lighting is going to reveal the set in the way I want it revealed. And it's not something that I can articulate, really. That is more of a gut feeling. But so that's incredibly important to me, who that person is.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I do think that would be sort of essential, that you and the lighting designer have the same vocabulary in terms of what you're trying to achieve, because I can imagine it being a hair-pulling ordeal if you're not getting that other visual support.
Yeah, it is crucial. And I was saying this to some students the other day. I feel like I'm saying all these things I said to students, but it's who I end up talking about these sort of conceptual design ideas to the most. It's a little bit like dating in a way, the relationships within the theater. And I don't mean that in a sexual way, but I mean it that, like, I think everybody in their romantic life has had the experience of seeing someone who they think is very attractive from a distance. And then when you get to meet them, either you find them attractive in person, or you're like, oh my God, what was I thinking? And I find that is true in the theater too, in terms of, artistic collaboration. There's people whose work, when I see it, I like, but when we work together, there just are not sparks. We're not connecting, we're not communicating, we are not making something better by the two of us working together, both with directors, with lighting designers, with whoever. And for a theater relationship to work well, the 2 or 3 or 6 people coming together to collaborate on a project, you have to have sparks. You have to have creative sparks that start flying, where I say X and you say Y and we get to Z. And it's something that neither of us would have done on our own, but together we've come up with this thing that is better than what either of us could have done on our own. And that's true of my relationship with the director. It's true of my relationship with the other designers. I think it's true of the director's relationship with the actors. I'm sure it's true of writers and directors working together, that when that chemistry works, it can be brilliant. And when it doesn't work, there's not much to do about it. It's not something that you can outthink. You can fall back on craft, and that will get you, a certain distance to solving things. But for something to really be brilliant, you kind of need those collaborative sparks to start flying.
Mm-hmm.
Beowulf, is the book an extension of your desire to be a professor?
My wife claims that because my father was a professor and quite a prolific author, that's why I wrote a book. And she's probably right. I think in the back of my head, I felt like it was something you were supposed to do. I will say that the book came from 2 things. One was, I have not actually taught in an official way in many years, but I talk to classes frequently as a guest speaker. And the question that I'm asked most often by design students is to describe my design process. And I kind of just described it to you guys, but there is no ABC process that I have. And so the best way I could think of to describe my process was to just talk about a bunch of different shows. And there are similarities in each chapter, and there are differences. But that was the best way I could think of to describe my design process. And the other thing that really got me going on it is I just had the incredible good fortune to work with some of the legends of the American theater, from Hal Prince, on through to the others in there. And when I had in the back of my head that I might write this book, I started it about 6-7 years ago, and Hal was getting up there. And I thought, if I want to do this and I want to be able to have these directors actively be part of it, I don't have forever. I have to get going on this. And I was frankly scared of trying to sit down and write because as I say, my father was a writer and he was kind of my tutor in high school. So I had a good writing teacher in high school, and I had a literature degree from Vassar. So I was taught to write. But I haven't done it actively in 25 years, and I certainly had never tried to write a book before. And I was just nervous about it. It felt audacious to think that I could do that. And I made a deal with myself that I had to write a chapter before I was going to let myself go interview Hal. And that was the thing that made me write the first chapter. And once I'd written a chapter, then I thought, okay, you can do this. Like, you wrote a chapter. Writing 12 chapters is just doing that 12 times over. And that may take a while, but I've said to people a number of times when they congratulated me on the book, I said, it's not, having written a book is an achievement of endurance. It doesn't mean that it's good. Anybody who can put words on a page can write 100,000 words. Whether they are coherent or not is another thing. But just this sort of the endurance test of doing it was significant. It was a lot of time writing it. I'm sure you guys know this because you're writers. I was shocked at how long the editing process was and how grueling the editing process was. And I frankly found that part harder than the writing process. So it was those two things together. It was trying to kind of lay out my design process such as it is, because it is a kind of a disorganized thing. And I think a certain amount of disorder is artistically good, frankly. I don't want to try to get too streamlined because I think it makes the art less interesting. It makes things start to just all kind of fall into a pattern once it becomes too streamlined. And quite frankly, the wanting to talk about design with some of these incredible directors who I've had the chance to work with and see their varying different takes on how they use this as a tool for storytelling.
I have one little more question, just like specifically about like designing for a tour, because I think you did a Come From Away for like various places, but you also did the tour, right? So how do you adapt something for a tour? Like what are like, okay, it has to fit into X number of trucks, or like how does it work?
It does become very mechanical in a way. In general, not all, but most of the tours I've done have been a Broadway show that is then going out on the road. So the first goal usually is, how do you take a version of the Broadway design and present that as accurately and completely as possible. But you're going into a lot of different size theaters. And honestly, what we do is you take the smallest theater and you design for that. And that's what the set is going to be in every other theater. And it's not that I couldn't make a set that can get bigger and smaller, but the light plot also has to match for every theater. And there's not time to rewrite all the light cues for every theater. And so it all has to just go in as a package. In general, when you're touring, anything but the biggest Broadway shows, I've got maybe 8 hours, 12 hours at most to get that set into the theater. And so whatever I'm doing has got to be able to come off a truck at 6 a.m. on Monday, and there's going to be an audience seeing that show by Tuesday evening. So in the case of Come From Away, on Broadway, we used real trees. I went out into the Catskills with a lumberjack, and we cut down real trees and dragged them into the theater. And the heaviest of them weigh about 6,000 pounds each. So it was a massive undertaking. On the road, they're all styrofoam because they all have to go in very quickly, come off a truck. And we made them so light that if it's difficult, if you're going into a theater with a weird back alley where the trees can't fit around the corners, we made them light enough that you can just bring them in right through the front door of the theater and walk down the aisle and toss them up on stage. But those trees on the road are, what we did is took a lot of photographs and very accurately did architectural drawings of the real trees on Broadway, and the shop then made copies of them. And my assistant spent a lot of time in the shop getting every knot and every kind of turn of the tree to look as much like the Broadway trees as possible. Not because it's crucial or that an audience is going to know, oh, this tree has a big knot in it, but because it made them look more real. It made them more accurate to be that completely minutely detailed in the way the real trees were. Anything natural like that, it is difficult to make accurate copies. And I found the best way to sort of get at natural forms is to either get the real thing or copy very, very exactly what nature has done.
Beowulf, I think Elizabeth and I would both take your course when you're.
I'm hopeless,
it.
so I.
But in the meantime, we have the book. It's called Transforming Space Over Time: Set Design and Visual Storytelling with Broadway's Legendary Directors by Beowulf Boritt. And we both really appreciate your time today, Beowulf. You're a great spokesman for your art form.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you both, and I'm so glad I had a chance to do it.
All right. Well, I guess that's it for us. That flew by. That's because we had so much to talk about after this. But we're going to be back on our regular. There's a lot. It's a very busy fall season, so we're going to have a lot to talk about. We're going to be back very, very soon.
Indeed. And we'll be talking to artists from across the country, people you'll want to hear from. Elizabeth and I, as you probably know, are on Twitter. If you want to converse with us, Elizabeth's handle is @evincentelli, her last name, and mine is @PeterMarksDrama. Please follow us, even if Elon Musk actually ends up buying the platform.
Oh my God! Yes. Oh, that's going to be fun. And
yeah,
of
really.
course, oh my God, marksvincentelli.substack.com. Easiest way to find us.
Yeah, we love doing this. We're happy to be doing it again, and hopefully COVID-free going forward.
I know.
So
and we're gonna have a special treat actually for our subscribers. We really we owe them one, and we've been plotting something fun.
Excellent. Exactly. So stay tuned for that. And so till we meet again, we are Peter Marks and Elizabeth Vincentelli on Marks and Vincentelli.